Hello and welcome everybody to my channel, Evan Writes. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic that seems rather confusing to a lot of people, and that would be character voice. We hear a lot of people talk about writing voicey characters, while we also get a lot of comments about what is a voicey character, how do I write one, and what is it that agents and publishers are looking for. If you heard that, that's my cat, by the way. She's in a playful mood, which she always seems to be as soon as I start videos. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. For this particular video, we are going to discuss character voice as seen through viewpoint characters. These are characters that we follow throughout the book. Third person limited, in first person, or sometimes when we swap different characters in other third person views. That's where you get the most of a character's voice, both internal and external. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So before we go ahead and get started, I just wanted to let you guys know that these things can be applied to any character, but you will see better results if you apply it to your main characters. Let's start this off with tip number 1. Understanding what character voice is. We cannot begin to approach a problem without first defining what it is and understanding it. Once we have that core understanding of what that thing is, we can then approach it in a more logical way. So we are going to go ahead and define character voice. A lot of people, when they say that they want a voicey character, what they really are saying is that they want a character with a distinguishable personality. Something that draws people to the character, something that makes them more relatable, something that we understand and aren't just told. So when you are writing a voicey character, think about it in terms of, what is your character's personality? Are you portraying that personality? Is it coming through in your writing? If you have somebody go and beta read your work and just a couple paragraphs of your character, and they can't tell what this character's personality is based on your writing for a page or two, then that means you should probably go back and address how to show off your character's personality in your writing. There are 2 parts of character voice that are addressed in your writing, and the first one is the most important, I would say. That would be the character's internal voice and the character's external voice. Tip number 2 is understanding your character's internal voice. Now, your character's internal voice is how they think and perceive the world. Now, this applies to an introvert or an extrovert. Introverts have mostly an internal voice. A lot of the character's personality is told through their thoughts and through how they perceive the world, how the world is being explained to the reader through this character's eyes, more so than through dialogue. An extroverted character, on the other hand, a lot of their voice comes from more of the external end, which we will get to a little later, where they actually have dialogue, where they have more body language. So, in short, internal voice are thoughts and thought patterns, and external voices are dialogue and body language that accompanies said dialogue. Now, how do we approach a character's internal voice? Well, let's approach it in a certain way. How do they analyze details? How do they see the world around them? Do they see things, or do they just simply glance over them? How much detail the reader gets depends on the point of view of the character you are speaking through. A scientist will see a lot more in a jar of pudding, because people have jars of pudding for some reason, than a regular person who just wants to eat it. The scientist might look and wonder, what kind of ingredients it has in it, what its chemical makeup is, if they really care that much or if they want to reproduce it, while somebody who just wants to eat the food won't really bother mentioning it more than, oh, I just ate a jar of pudding. So there's a lot that goes into character voice for their internal voices. How are they perceiving the world? What do they describe? What do they hone in on? Not everybody will see the same thing when they walk into a room. Some people will see the paintings, other people won't even notice that they are there. Some people will see the food, other people will be too busy looking at the bookshelves, like most of us probably. How that all works. So character internal voice, a lot of it is how they are perceiving the world and how that is explained to the reader. Now, this comes through in form of narration. This mixes a lot with author voice, which is why it's so difficult for people to write voicey characters, because they have to separate themselves from their author voice enough that each character feels different, that each character has their own personality and they see the world in their way, because no two people are the same. Another thing that goes into it is, are they a sarcastic personality? Are they self-doubting? Are they overconfident? There's a lot of things that go into just the character's personality overall that will shade how they talk, which will come more into the external voice, but also how they think and perceive other people and events that come through. So as you are considering writing your character, make sure you realize, what kind of person is this? What would they really be thinking in this moment? Avoid thinking, as your author voice, and think in the character voice. This is a lot harder to do than it seems for a lot of people, and it's even more difficult when you have books that switch perspectives, because you have to get each perspective to feel distinct. And how do you do that? Well, you make sure you get that personality in there. Sarcasm, self-loathing, doubting, gung-ho, I'm gonna beat the bad guy, I'm better than everything. There's just a lot that goes into people's personalities that you want to try to get across, and it's that difference in personality that makes people connect and find things interesting. Reading things through another person's perspective is fun, and that's why we want those things called voicey characters, because we get that perspective and we can relate a little bit and also get the new. That's also one of the reasons why when people go and do retellings of stories through another character's eyes, we find it fascinating. It's not that the story is new in any way, shape, or form. We've heard Cinderella 500 times, but if we heard Cinderella through the voice of the stepmother, and the story revolved around her and her experiences, and the world was colored through her lens, well, that would be a very interesting story. Why? Because we haven't seen it before. It's the exact same story, the exact same events, but it's colored through a new perspective. And that's the voice that you want in your writing. You want to get that perspective, how those people see the world and why it's so different than other books we've read. We can go read another book just like Star Wars or just like Aragon that has very similar story structure, but if the protagonist or whoever we are following through the story speaks in a different way, then we get an entirely new perspective. We get a new story. We get that new feeling, and that's why something that's so used to be seen, something that we're so used to seeing, can feel so fun and new, even though people will come back later and say that's exactly like Harry Potter, that's exactly like Lord of the Rings. Well, no, it's not, because we had a new perspective. Moving on, internal voice tells us a lot about a character, and internal voice is very unique to books. Why? Because we don't get a lot of it in other media. The only way they can show this in films, I guess we can get it a little bit in comics, but that would be hearing the character's thoughts, or in comics thought bubbles, but they aren't very common and they're only saved for crucial instances. We don't get the world described to us through the lens of the character. We see it visually through the lens of the artist, which is why books are very interesting and a lot more difficult to come across and to pull these things off, is because we have to color that lens in an interesting way while staying true to the character. Now, we do get to look inside the character with their internal voice, and we need to truly understand their motivations. That's why books are so awesome, is because we know their motivations. If any of you guys have read Ender's Game, you know that the book and the movie are very different. Why? Because we saw the events pass in the movie in a very different way than they did in the book, and the big ending for the book was spoiled super early on in the movie because we couldn't get color through the perspective of Ender's mind. We just had to watch what he did. So it was a very different experience, and that's what happens in media. You have to account for the medium. So we need to know, do they manipulate others? Are they easily beguiled? What is their personality type? What are their motivations? It's the most crucial part of character voice, and it's the hardest to deliver because it requires one to understand how people think and how they act. Sometimes you as a writer would do the opposite of what a character does in the book, and that's why it's so hard to write sometimes, because you know what's going to happen. You don't want the characters to do something that doesn't sound smart, but people do that. People do things that don't sound smart, and that's what gives that character voice. So as you're going, just know that tip number 2 is focusing on your character's internal voice. This is the most important part of a character's voice, is understanding their motivations and how they color the world through their lens. If you're writing one character, they are going to describe things differently than other characters will. They will focus on different things, and they will care about other things. Different people will affect them differently, and it's that cohesion that makes a character voicey and very interesting for us to read. Tip number 3. Okay, so tip number 3 is the character's external voice. It's understanding what external voice is and how to approach it. Character external voice, as I defined earlier, is the character's dialogue, what they say, and also their body language. So it's what they are doing. So their voice isn't just their words. It's their meaning behind them and what impression they are giving to other people. This is the part that people can see. This is the part that movies and everything focus on, because we have to see those reactions. We have to see we have to hear what they're saying, and we have to understand, are they being sarcastic? Are they fidgeting? Can we tell if they're lying? It's all of those kinds of things that play into the character's external voice. Combined, the internal and external voices make the character voice. So the external voice relies on a lot of things. What's the character's emotional state at the time? Depending on their emotional state, if they're angry, sad, nonchalant, hopeful, miserable, anything will color a slight change in how they're reacting to the things around them. If somebody's really sad and depressed, they're going to move differently. And saying and including how a character moves and what their reactions are physically to something adds the character's external voice and makes a character more interesting, because we get to see how they are reacting as opposed to just hearing words. That gives us that acting that we don't get to see visually, because this isn't a movie. It gives us those more movie moments, and that's why we need to make sure we focus on not just characters' words, but also their body language, and give equal measure to both of those things. Other things that can change characters' external voices could be their culture, their education, how much do they know, how will they speak based on their culture. If we go and we look at, for example, I've been reading Elantris. If any of you have ever read Elantris, Galadon in Elantris is a character who always adds "do you understand" to the end of most of what he says. He says it in the word of his people, Kolo, but it means "do you understand?" And he says it all the time. Now that's something that comes from his culture. It's something that he does in the book that almost nobody else in the book does, because he's the only one from that culture that we really get to know. So understanding a character's culture and their education can play into that external voice, what we see, what we hear, and their body language. Body language varies from culture to culture. Some things are considered unfavorable in some cultures, while they might be completely normal in others. When I went to visit South America, it was very bad to put your elbows onto the table while you were eating, but in America, people do it all the time. So things like that will change based on your character's culture and their education, and getting a little bit of that into your book increases your character's external voice immensely. Also, what changes it is based on their age and their gender. Especially the gender also affects internal voices, because men and women do think differently, and getting that to come across is really important, I think, in some cases. Maybe getting somebody of the opposite gender to read your male or female characters and see if things kind of feel like they're too masculine or feminine for that specific character can help you out a little bit. You don't want everything to sound too much of the same. But nowadays things are getting more mixed anyway, now that masculinity and femininity are starting to merge into more of a cohesive humanity, I guess. But depending on where you're writing, that might change. If you're writing a medieval fantasy, you're going to have some very toxic masculinity in there, or some extreme femininity, or some things in the middle. So that's something that could change your character's external voices. It also changes based on who they are talking to. So if you are talking to a king, you're going to talk very differently to a king or a baron or somebody in high standing than you will to a peasant in the street. So that plays into external voice as well. How does your character treat characters of different social standings, of different religions? That plays a little bit into internal voice too, because you can kind of go through their thought processes on why they're treating this person differently. Not necessarily explaining why, but just, oh, I hate such and such religion. Like, I hate this guy because, they believe in, sacrificing women every Sunday, or who knows. So that kind of stuff can play into external voice as well. And depending on how you develop your cultures in your book, that's something to think about and something to consider to include. Last thing is, do your characters have tells? I mentioned this a little bit with Galadon from Elantris earlier. Tells are things that people are bound to repeat just based on their personality. Writers have tells. They will certainly go back to words that they use a lot more often, and it gets annoying once you kind of catch on to what words you use a lot. I've noticed that when I've watched my videos, I've caught some words that I use a lot more often than I thought I did. So it's something to keep in mind. Does your character have words that they repeat? If we go and we talk about Mistborn Era 2, we talk about Wayne. He has a fascination with hats, and he always talks about hats. Now that is a tell for that character. He could accidentally slip up and mention something about a hat, and people could probably see him through a disguise because of that fascination of his. Now these tells can help add to your character's external voice. Now that's it for character external voices and internal voices. Now we're going to try to talk about combining them. We can't talk about character voice without talking about character progression. So for the fourth tip, we're going to talk about character arcs. Now this is how the character changes and progresses throughout the story. How they see the world will change based on the events they live. So that change and that growing up as a character needs to be shown in your writing and add to a character voice. With character voice, some revelations come like a day and night cycle where they have a really huge impacting event that changes how they think almost in the moment. If any of you have ever played Tales of the Abyss, I'm going to give a spoiler right now so you can skip over 30 seconds if you don't want to be spoiled on that video game Tales of the Abyss. There is a character named Luke who is a very spoiled, rich person who is the main character of the story. As he progresses through the story, he learns that he's not really more special than anybody else. In fact, he learns other things that may even make him think even less than himself than other people. And as soon as he realizes that, he has this huge impacting moment of change where he cuts his hair symbolically to prove that he's changed his thought, and he becomes an amazing character after that. He is one of the best character growth arcs I've ever seen done in a game or in books or anything. It was just amazing how they pulled it off, because you hate that character through most of the story, and once that happens, once he has that night and day change where he realizes who he's been and how selfish he was and how bad it was, he has that character change where he becomes more helpful towards other people, more accepting, and it's just amazing. Now those events can happen to people. Large grand scale events will change people who live through them. So there are times where your character's personality and your character's voice can change almost instantly. However, it is also important to note the gradual progression of a character throughout a story as well. Characters won't always be the same person they are at the start of the book, but it's not always going to be a night and day change either. They are going to have to learn things little by little, and maybe there's a character who curses a lot, who once they get a girlfriend in this love story who hates cursing, this character slowly starts to curse less and catch himself more, and it becomes a gradual change. Those are the kind of changes we like to see in characters and add to their voice as well. Things that are subtle, things that are nice, as well as those large night and day differences. So character arcs are important when it comes to character voice, because unless they're Superman and already a solidified character, if this character is meant to go through an arc in your story, we need to see that in their voice as well. They aren't Some characters will be stoic, and the Superman-like character who has their morals set in stone and will not change anything, and that can be interesting to read sometimes because we see how other people react to that person, but their voice innately isn't very interesting usually. So just make sure as you go through and write your character, for that fourth tip, it is to make sure that you write your character arcs into their voice. Make sure that that voice is changing slightly or sometimes on a grand scale based on the character you write. The fifth and final tip of this video, and it goes almost without saying, in order to get better at writing character voice, you just simply have to write more. Write more characters, write more situations, focus on explaining the same environment through different people's eyes. This brings us to the idea of using writing prompts. Take multiple characters, put them in the same situation, but tell it through their eyes. Now, this will help you to realize the differences between each character and what makes your character's voices what they are. And it'll help you realize if your character does have a voice or if it doesn't, or if your characters all seem the same. So have all your characters walk into a bar, have all your characters walk into a spooky forest, have your characters trying to decide whether or not they want to enter a fight that just started near them. Taking a situation and putting multiple characters through that situation and practicing writing each of them will help you to develop your character voices, and will help you to develop that author skill to be able to talk through multiple characters. You get the external voices, making sure you're focusing on body language and the dialogue and what it is they are physically doing. That way you're showing us and not just telling us. We need to know what they are doing. You can watch one of my other videos to get more about that information. And then you also want to focus on your internal voice, where you're coloring the world through that character's eyes. What are they focusing on? What is most important to them? What do they see? What don't they see? All those things combined together add and create your character voice, and it makes a very interesting experience, and it's what we want when we go and read a book. If we don't get that, we get very bored very fast, or we end up focusing on other characters that do seem to have a voice, which is why when we take our viewpoint characters, we want them to be the most voicey characters there are. That's why people are asking for voicey characters, is because you're going to live through this story, you're going to read through this story through the viewpoint character, and if the viewpoint character does not have that voice, does not have that interesting perspective, and show it through their body language, their dialogue, their internal monologuing, their focuses, their perspective, then we're just not going to have very fun reading the book, and a lot of people might just quit on it right away. So we want to make sure that your voicey characters, your characters who are strongest with their personality, are the ones that you're telling your story through. If we go and look, for example, at Zootopia. Now, this isn't a book, but Zootopia was originally told through Nick's perspective, the fox. And they decided that it was a little too strong of a topic to go through with just him. They needed something more lighthearted. It just wasn't the right fit for their viewpoint character, so they made him a strong side character who was present throughout most of the film, and went instead with Hop, the rabbit character, who had more of a lighthearted character arc and character story. So when we got colored with the very dark story of Nick, it wasn't as overwhelming as it would have been if we followed him from the first scene. So there's a lot to consider. Maybe you're just writing your book through the wrong perspective. If you find that you have a character who has a lot better voice, it might just be an overhaul where you just go and you switch perspectives and the story is great. Maybe you can fix other stories that way. That's not always the case. Maybe you can just increase your character voice by focusing a little bit more on their body language and getting out that external voice a little bit more, and focusing on their internal voice and how they're coloring the world. There's a lot of things you can do as you go through and look through your stories to make them better and more voicey. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my list. Let's go ahead and talk one more time, recap everything. The 5 tips for improving your character's voice and writing voicey characters. The first one is to understand that a voicey character is basically the character's personality. It consists of their internal voice and their external voice. The compilation of the two creates your character's voice. Now, that character voice will usually not stay the same throughout a book, so make sure your voice goes through in a character arc. You are talking about the world, you're talking about how they see the world, their internal monologues, their thoughts, and their actions, so their body language and their dialogue. All those combine into a character's voice. A character might think very differently on the inside than he actually says on the outside, and that is part of what makes an interesting character, is when we have the perspective of both internal and external voices. And the last thing, if you want to get better at character voice, use writing prompts, okay? It's not that difficult. Focus on the language you're using, the body language of the characters, the thoughts versus what is actually said, and their reaction to events. And a fun way to do this, as I said before, is to simply throw a lot of characters into the same situation and see how their personality colors the scene differently. If you liked this content, go ahead and like my channel and subscribe. I actually don't know if I'm pointing to the bell or anything, but go ahead and ring it so you guys know when my videos go live. If you liked this type of content, that is a listing video, it's the first one I've done of this type, let me know and I will go ahead and plan to make more in the future. If this was helpful for you, let me know. If you want me to go in more detail on any of these, go ahead and leave a comment and I will consider doing a video more in depth to any of these particular tips in the future. I hope this is helpful for some of you, gives you some good insight. Anyway, have a great day and I will see you on the other side.